Before we start, we need to review what these symbols mean. This means the I form, you, he, she, it, we, y'all, they. The forward-looking head means forward-looking or prospective into the future. Backward-looking head is backward-looking or retrospective into the past. Also, the passive forms we know now. I am blanked, you are blanked, he, she, it is blanked, we are blanked, y'all are blanked, and they are blanked. Alrighty, so we first should probably briefly review how we get the present stem, like woka in this case. Remember, there's two possible rules you can use. The old standard rule is for the first two conjugations to take the second principal part minus re, and then for the remaining conjugations to take the first principal part minus o. But I told you that that is very confusing and that a better rule to follow would just be to remember that these 5 conjugations follow the 5 rules: long A verbs, long E verbs, nothing verbs because the stem ends in nothing, short I verbs, and long I verbs. There are about 7 or 8 different kinds of subjunctive clauses, which will take a subjunctive, and we are going to learn them now. The ones above the line here are all forward-looking or prospective, so almost all the verbs are present stem subjunctives. They are the result clause, the purpose clause, and the indirect command. Next is the hortatory or jussive subjunctive. This one is unique and strange and fun because it's so easy. It doesn't need a main verb, and it doesn't even need a conjunction like ut. It can just be by itself. So it's let blank happen or may blank happen is the hortatory or jussive subjunctive. The ones down here now below the line have both kinds of subjunctives in them, so they're much more complex and difficult. First, we're going to learn the CUM clause, which of course always uses cum as its adverb, almost always. Okay, so our next subjunctive is the hortatory subjunctive, and this is the easy one, which does not need either a main verb or even a conjunction like ut. So it can just be colat. That's a sentence right there. Let him cultivate it. Prosit ei, may it profit him. May he cultivate, may he sow, may he reap, or let it profit him, let him cultivate, let him sow, let him reap. Now, if you want to be nice, you could include an ut prosit ei, that it may profit him. Or, if you want to be really cool, you could use an utinam. Oh, that it may profit him. Oh, that he may reap. So this is ways to ham it up. Notice in all of these, there is no main verb anywhere. It is a hortatory subjunctive verb, can stand by itself as a sentence, and it doesn't even need the ut. So anytime you see a subjunctive just standing by its lonesome self out in the middle of nowhere, then it's probably a hortatory subjunctive. Now, do you know where the word hortatory means? Remember this verb hortor, hortari, hortatasum from earlier on in your vocab? Yeah, that means to urge. So this is the subjunctive that is urging you. In this hortatory subjunctive, watch out in particular for these 3 irregular verbs, which are used very commonly as hortatory subjunctives. As you can see here, they have no passive because they are irregular. And it is sum, esse, to be, and eo ire, to go. And then the third one we'll get on the next slide. The subjunctive of sum esse is sim, and the subjunctive of eo ire is eam. And, of course, these are irregular, meaning may be or may go. But they can have certain prefixes. Sim on top often gets pro, meaning may it profit, like prosit ei, may it be profitable to him. Or de, like desit, may he lack. Down low, eam commonly gets the 3 directional prefixes. Adeam, toward, to go toward or to approach. And like adeamos, let us approach. Or abeam, abeant, let them leave, please. Or Redeatis. Let y'all return back to where you came from, something like that. Okay. The third irregular verb is from this facio facere down low, which of course means to make or do, very common in Latin. But it causes this derivative semi-deponent that comes from it. Fieri factus sum. Now you can see it looks perfectly active in the first principal part and perfectly passive in the third principal part, just like a deponent. But then in the middle, it's something weird going on. I don't even know what that is, because it looks like a second conjugation passive infinitive, like, eri, but it should have a macron over the e, which it doesn't, so I don't know. Anyways, it's gray, which means it's a semi-deponent, halfway in between normal verbs and deponents, which would be full black. And anyways, so facio facere down low means to make or do. It's very active. It's a very active verb. Fieri factus sum, you would think it would be like a passive verb, but it's not quite. Its translation means to become. So it's not like it was made, which would be passive. It's more like in between me, the maker, and the done to over there that was made, there's this idea of becoming of itself on its own. And that is the idea of become, or an alternative meaning is come about. Common translations also given are happen, or may it occur, come about. So watch out in particular for this weird form, fio fis fit, fimus fitus fiunt. I become, you become, he becomes, we become, you all become, they become. Is commonly used in the subjunctive. Fiam, fias, fiat, like in the Lord's Prayer. Fiat voluntas tua. May your will, O God, come about. Fiamus, fiatus, and fiat. All right, so let's categorize all these four kinds of subjunctives that we've learned so far. I want you to tell me what kind of subjunctive it is using those tip-off signs. So remember, they were like a form of tom for result clause, or for indirect command, one of your verbs of commanding or begging or saying or punishing, things like that. Or if it's neither of those, then it's probably a purpose clause, especially if it demonstrates some sort of willpower of what someone is scheming and intending and purposing to do. That's probably a purpose clause. So stop the video and go question by question and try to decide in advance what kind of clause each of these are. There are 2 slides here, so after you finish this slide, then go on and do the next slide as well. And you also see a reason occur on the far right here telling why it is that particular kind of clause. All right, so our next clause is a CUM clause. And these things are powerful, and I think they're pretty fun as well. So now a CUM conjunction can have all these meanings that you see below here. A CUM temporal clause is where the CUM has the sense of when or while or after. A CUM causal clause is when the CUM has a sense of since or because. And a CUM concessive clause is when the CUM has a sense of although. So all of this from this tiny little word CUM. Where did the CUM come from? So the word for this is implicit. All these meanings here are implicit or could be implicit in the CUM. Now where did CUM come from? Well, CUM is just a Q form of tum. Remember how you had quam tam, like as is blank, so is blank, and quantus tantus and all those? Well, here cum used to be QUM, then TUM. And now you know that tum means then, so cum means in some sense now. And that's the basic meaning, but the problem is that this is subjunctive, so it's relative to the time of the main verb. So it doesn't always actually mean now. It really means when at that point in time, whenever the main verb was. So this is the most essential meaning of cum that I want you to learn. Whereas at that time, and or given that at that time. Now, why do I say whereas? Because whereas is the best English word that encompasses both since and although. You can say, since I won the race, I was happy. Although I lost the race, I was happy. Both of those can be replaced by whereas easily. Whereas I won the race, I was happy. Whereas I lost the race, I was not happy. So see how whereas does double duty. So that's why you need to remember whereas as one of the two most basic meanings of cum. The other most basic meaning is when, because when will cover for all of these. So after we would have eaten, the ceiling fell in on us, could become when we would have eaten, the ceiling fell in on us, and it still kind of works. So cum can mean any of these things. So when and whereas, therefore, are the two main literal meanings of cum. I want you to memorize both of these. And a slightly longer way to say that, which will make your sentences flow much more easily, to make you instantly understand their sense, is to put them together. Say to yourself, whereas at that time. If you say whereas at that time at every single cum, then you will get it, I guarantee it. You will understand the inner meaning of the cum clause, no matter which one of these 5 figurative meanings it may have. Whereas at that time I lost the race, I was sad. You'll understand that that was although. Okay, so whereas and at that time are your literal senses. When, while, after, since, and although are your contextual senses or figurative senses of cum. So better is to memorize the literal, but if you need to translate and make it fancy for someone, then you're going to want to use one out of these 5 contextual meanings here, because it just sounds bad to be saying, whereas at that time, blah, blah, blah. But you will understand all the meanings of cum if you remember whereas at that time. Now, I also gave 2 other alternatives to whereas. What are they? Well, whereas is when cum is at the start of the sentence, when the cum clause comes first. Cum, yada, 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 blah, 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 like that. The other 2 are when cum comes in the middle of the sentence. Blah, 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 cum, yada, yada, yada. So in this case, you'd say blah, 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 given that at that time, yada, yada, yada. Or blah, 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 considering that at that time, yada, yada, yada. So cum and its cum clause can be in either half of the sentence. And depending where it is, it'll be smoother for you if you use the correct version of whereas. So depending where the main verb is, the cum clause can mean whereas at this time or whereas at that time. That's just a minor alteration. If you didn't even remember this, it wouldn't matter. Who cares? Okay, and then if it's in the middle of the sentence, we'd have given at this time, given at that time. So I'd like you to try these now. Decide which of the 3 literal senses of cum would be appropriate. This is only 3 questions, so you're only getting your feet wet. Let's do it together. Nihil temere debebamus. We were owing it to fear nothing. Cum ferox leo catenis vinctus esset. Now, cum is in the middle of the sentence, so let's say, given that at that time, and at that time, since it was past, the fierce lion with chains might have been bound. See how that works? We should not have feared, given that at that time, the fierce lion with chains might have been bound. So we're going to pick B here, given that. Next one. Nuper fabrum cum orbis clavibus herri vidi, quamquam lex tale non desinit. All right, so recently, a craftsman with the city's keys yesterday I saw, although the law such does not permit. All right, so what usage of cum would this be? Well, obviously it's cum clauibus, cum plus the ablative. So this isn't even a cum clause at all. Okay, joy, joy. That's going to be your standard meaning of cum that you were used to up until now, with. So don't forget, with could be the meaning of cum, and it might not be a cum clause at all. So you have to find a subjunctive somewhere for it to be a cum clause. So if it's a cum clause, then it has to introduce a whole clause, which is a whole sentence. If it's just a little phrase, like with the keys, then that's not a cum clause. All right, so lastly, when cum tremerem Now this time the cum is at the front, so it's going to be whereas. Cum tremorem me frigidum sentiebam. Whereas at that time I was shivering, myself cold I was feeling. I felt myself cold. And there's your answers. Okay, so the first one, nil temere debebamos, cum ferax leo catenis vinctus esse. I look at cum, I notice it's in the middle of the sentence, and I also notice that it introduces a whole clause, so it's going to be a cum clause because it's starting a whole clause, not just one ablative word. I introduce that it's introducing a whole clause, so it's going to be a cum clause, and so since it's in the middle of the sentence, it's given that. Next one, nuper fabrum cum urbis clavibus heri vidi, quamquam lex tale non desinit. Now look at this. The comma is here. The cum is not at the start of a clause because you would expect it to be where the nuper is or where the quamquam is, introducing that whole clause. But it's right in the middle. What's that? Well, in this case, it's actually cum clavibus is just the phrase, with the keys of the city. So this is not a cum clause at all. This is just your old meaning of cum as with. So watch out for this. Cum might not always be introducing a whole clause. It might just be introducing a tiny little phrase inside of a clause. And that's not a cum clause. That's a standard ablative of means or accompaniment or something like that. So just watch out for that. Lastly, cum tremorem me frigidum sentiebam. Okay, so here we have cum at the start of a whole clause, and it's at the start of the sentence, so this one's going to be whereas. And you see those are the answers. Brilliant. Okay. So now you know pretty well how to recognize which of the literal senses of cum are correct. Now let's dig in and figure out which of the figurative or contextual senses of cum are correct. We have 5 of them up here, as we said, and this is how you figure out which one is appropriate to the given situation. So when you have a main verb, you could have a backward-looking subjunctive action feeding into it, or it could be talking about a forward-looking subjunctive action jutting off into the future. Well, if it's talking about the past, then you can have after, because after we would have blanked, we blanked, is how that would go. If it's talking about the present or future, then you could use while. We blank while something may happen, is how that would go. When can work for either of them. So when is the safest of all 5 of these figurative contextual meanings, because when can cover any time whatsoever. All right, so both of those can become whens. But when you translate it as when, while, or after, if the meaning sounds kind of lame and like, so what? Like some actor out on the stage doing something completely divorced from surrounding circumstances, like, when I won the race, I was happy. Huh? And you really want a more meaty explanation? Probably it's one of the other 2 meanings that is the best one, since or although. So instead of when, while, and after, you might want to try since. And you notice here, since is a substitute for after, not a substitute for while, covering an event before the main verb. Since we might have blanked, therefore main verb we blanked. Although is the same way. Although something might have happened, this happened. So instead of after, you might want to try since or although. So those are our 5 meanings, when, while, since, and although. When is always appropriate. After and while, one or the other will be appropriate depending whether it's a forward-looking subjunctive or a backward-looking subjunctive. And then lastly, since and although might be appropriate, and only if it's a backward-looking subjunctive. Almost always. Rarely a forward-looking subjunctive, but is rare. So decide which one or ones, because multiple ones could work, of the 5 contextual meanings could be appropriate. When, while, after, since, or although. Nihil temere debebamus cum ferax leo catenis vinctus esse. Mr. Rudman, I don't know what that means. Oh, well, push the clue and it will tell you. We owed it not to have been fearing, given that the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. All right, well, when is always appropriate. So you know A is going to be the answer for all of these, right? While was when we have forward-looking subjunctives. Let's look. Do we have a forward-looking subjunctive? Esset, is that a forward-looking subjunctive? It could be, but vinctus esset is a backward-looking subjunctive. That's the passive of vinxerit. So actually this one could go either way, because you could treat the verb as just esset, with vinctus being an adjective, unimportant adjective, or you could treat the verb as being the whole thing, vinctus esset, in which case it's backward-looking. So, you know, really any of these could work, while or after. We owed it not to have been fearing. We owed it not to have been fearing after the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Yeah, that works. We owed it not to have been fearing while the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Nah, that doesn't work. Because you don't say while referring to an event even farther back in the past. So that one doesn't work. After works, and now let's try when. We owed it not to have been fearing when the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. Yeah, that works, but it's lame, isn't it? So let's try one of the two alternate, causal or concessive. We owed it not to have been fearing since the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. That satisfies me. Now, if the since works, the although almost certainly won't. But let's try it anyways. We owed it not to have been fearing although the fierce lion would have been bound with chains. What's your problem? You mean that you should have been afraid because he was tied up? So that makes no logical sense at all. So our answers, therefore, are going to be A, C, and D. Stop the video, try the rest of these, and then start it again when you're ready to see the answers. All right, so there are your meanings of cum. We'll put those up there. And now let's go into the understanding of the subjunctive verb inside the cum clause. Any of these will work. Any tense of the subjunctive, any SH, W, C, or M form of the verb. I encourage you to use these all the time in your subjunctive clause. In a second, we're going to find how most people do cum clauses today, and that is that they translate it as if it were an indicative, without these SH, W, C, or M helper words. And to me, that destroys the subjunctive sense or connotation of the cum clause. So I encourage you to just translate it literally according to your standard SH, W, C, M rules, not to use what they do. But you'll see what they do in a second. All right, so now you should know how other people translate cum clauses, because they may tell you this stuff. And maybe it might be helpful to you at some point, but I don't think it's going to. Now, the old way is that they still use shall and will, can, may forms, but should, would, could, might forms, they don't. Instead, they translate these as an indicative. So the way they translate these are like a normal indicative. When he was blanking, they say, or when he had blanked. And they call it the pluperfect subjunctive for that reason. Because that the pluperfect subjunctive on the timeline frequently is at the same time as the past backward-looking subjunctive, therefore they call this the pluperfect subjunctive. Because translating it this way is safe. Had is always farthest back in time, so if you translate it as had, then yeah, it'll work. But you're starting to build a system here that is not going to work out in the end. The main problem with this is that pluperfect designates a definitive time on the timeline, had blanked, back then, whereas subjunctives are supposed by nature to be variable and able to move on the timeline hazily relative to where their main verb is. So subjunctives are supposed to designate general circumstances, not an exact time. And so by calling it pluperfect subjunctive, they're implying that it has an exact time when really it doesn't, and it's going to mess them up when they get into these later tenses up here. So for this one, they logically call it the imperfect subjunctive because it frequently works. Not always, because sometimes they are forced into would, so they're already having problems there. And then they want to continue their system and they say, oh, well, what's the shall of, will of, can of, may of? We had two past versions here. Let's call that the perfect subjunctive. which I've already said that makes no sense because this thing is relative to the future tense. If shall have blanked, then will blank. So it's often talking about things in the future, whereas they call it the perfect subjunctive as if it's sometime back in the past, which is completely wrong. But you don't even have to worry about that because it's so rare that you'll hardly ever see it in Latin. And then for this last one, they call it the present subjunctive. And I don't really have a problem with that because that's basically what I call it. I call it the present plus because it also can include an action occurring in the future, shall, will, but they don't mention that. So their names are giving you the misimpression that these subjunctives occur at set places on the timeline when they don't. So I don't recommend that you say cum when blank was happening, or had happened, or when blank happens, just like a normal indicative. Say it the way it should be, the way it's written. When something may happen, when something should happen, when something should have happened. And that will remind you that this is just a general hypothetical imaginary circumstance, not an actual event, which they then must do more acrobatics later to accommodate for in their translations. And they'll dream up little phrases like less vivid and contrary to fact. Well, you'll already know it's less vivid and contrary to fact if you're translating it like should and shall. So obviously this is a better system, I think. All right, so how do you make the subjunctive verbs? Well, remember, you can start with either kind of stem, regardless of where the main verb is. And let's go through a couple of these. Id non difficula est is a present main verb. Cum tantum equitatu valeamus, when we should be so strong in cavalry. All right. Well, this is obviously going to be in the green sphere because it's got a green present stem. So that's the present forward-looking subjunctive. And here's how you're going to translate it. Just take it in order. It is not difficult, given that, considering that at this time, we may avail or be strong so much in cavalry. And remember that instead of given, considering that, you could use one of these five. In this case, the ones that will work are since, when, and while. It isn't difficult since we may avail so strong in cavalry. Cum primi ordines cecidissent, it's going to be one of those two. Tamen acerrime reliqui resistebant. Well, bant is past, so it's going to be the left one. All right, put it in place. Whereas at that time, the first rows should have fallen. Alternately, you could use their way of translating it like an indicative, were having fallen or had fallen. Tamen, however, the rest were resisting bitterly. In this case, the ones that will work are although, when, and after. And the big giveaway is, look here, tamen, however. Obviously, if you've got a however, you're going to start with an although. And that's going to be your best translation for a fancy production. Atticus didn't seek honors, past tense. So there's where your main verb is. Cum ei paterent. And obviously this is forward-looking. Atticus didn't seek honors, given that, considering that at this time, they should lie open to him. And alternately, you could say although, or when or while, since it's a forward-looking one. And the way they would translate it is Atticus didn't seek honors since they were lying open to him, just as if it were a regular imperfect. But, you know, that seems pretty darn vivid. And I would rather you keep it subjunctive with should lie open, because that more conveys the actual sense of how a subjunctive is meant to be taken. Galli cum se defendere non possent. Now, you might think to yourself the cum is in the middle of the sentence. This is not a cum clause, but really it is, because it really is at the start of the sentence. Because really you can just flip the galli and cum, rearrange it to cum galli se defendere non possent. So watch out for something like this. But you know it's not just an ablative of means or accompaniment, because there's no ablative right after the cum. Nuntios ad Caesarem miserunt. The Gauls, given that, considering that at that time they should not be able to defend themselves, or couldn't defend themselves, or were not being able to defend themselves, sent messengers to Caesar. And for cum, you could alternately say since. Since the Gauls could not defend themselves, they sent messengers to Caesar. Or since it's forward-looking, while will work. All right, so change the underlined clause into a cum clause having a subjunctive verb. The bold adverb will disappear as its meaning gets absorbed by the cum. All right, so although is going to disappear. You're going to replace although with cum of some sort, and then you want to turn this whole underlined thing into a cum clause by making the verb subjunctive. Now, when you do this, you're going to think to yourself, well, which of the 4 tenses of subjunctive should I use? And look up here in the box for that. Remember, the subjunctive verb's action has to be before the main verb's action for you to use that backward-looking subjunctive. Anywhere else, if it's like at the same time as the main verb or later than the main verb, you're going to use a forward-looking subjunctive. So pay attention to what the relationship is between the main verb and the subjunctive verb. So although we were happy, they were angry. The main verb is were, and the subjunctive verb is were. Same time, this means that you're going to be using the forward-looking one, because you have to have earlier to use the backward-looking one. And if you're having trouble translating, you can use the clue and read it like this. Ei fuerent irati, whereas we might be happy. That'll work too. And the might be here is a dead giveaway. But hopefully you don't need to use these clues. It's better for you to get the practice of deciding where is the main verb on the timeline, and then is my subjunctive going to be forward or backward looking relative to that. All right, so stop the video and try these, and try the ones on the next slide as well, which are mainly passives, much more difficult, and then start it again when you're ready to keep going. All right, so that's it. So good luck and enjoy it, and start reading these subjunctive clauses like an expert. Walete.